Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam with Historic Travels, and as always, before we get started today, I just need to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subscribers and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you guys, I appreciate it. And if you would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the Historic Travels YouTube channel a little bit more, I did create a Patreon. There's a link for that down below. Thank you guys, that's awesome. And before we get started on this video, I do have one more announcement to make. Yesterday, we hit another huge milestone for the Historic Travels YouTube channel and passed the 30,000 subscriber mark. And guys, I am completely blown away. Seriously, I started YouTube really actively about 7 months ago, and I never dreamed that I would hit 30,000 subscribers in such a short amount of time. So everybody who's helped make this channel what it is and get this channel to this point, thank you all so much. It really means a lot. You know, getting to talk to you guys, whether it be on Facebook, Discord, in my comment section, some of the video ideas you guys have been giving out, it's honestly unbelievable, and I've met so many interesting people from taking this journey, and guys, I just, from the bottom of my heart, just thank you all so much. All right, guys, well, hey, without any further ado, let's get into today's topic. It is Sunday, April 14, 1912, 11:39 p.m. RMS Titanic is cruising along at 21-22 knots with First Officer William Murdoch on duty on the bridge, and in the crow's nest high above the Titanic is Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. All three men are doing their duty on the Titanic this night, keeping an eye out for icebergs and doing everything they can to ensure a safe passage on the RMS Titanic. A lot of people like to fault the RMS Titanic's crew for going into a known ice field at this speed, but you have to remember, even though they knew there was ice in the area, the conditions that night looked perfectly clear. So as far as the crew was concerned, any icebergs that would be a threat to the Titanic, they thought they could see it long before it would be any danger to the ship. However, what the crew did not realize is that there was a mirage effect going on that night, obscuring their view. So that meant that due to this mirage effect, they would not see any danger until it was literally right up in front of the Titanic. This picture does a great job in showcasing how the iceberg was hidden by this mirage effect that was in the area the Titanic was sailing that night. You see, the mirage effect generated what's called a false horizon. So anybody on board the Titanic, when they're looking straight ahead out into the night, they would only see this false horizon. Nothing below this would be visible on board the Titanic until they were right up on it. And this iceberg was completely inside this false horizon layer, meaning the crew on board the Titanic did not see the iceberg until it was literally too late for them to act. Now you might be thinking right now, how did the Titanic's crew miss this mirage effect that was going on? Wouldn't it create some weird lighting effects and stuff? Or was this effect completely unknown to sailors in the days of Titanic? Well, no, sailors knew about mirage effects at sea. They were a thing that happened. But you see, the night the Titanic went down, it was a very odd night. Typically, the way you spot a mirage is due to other sources of light, like whether it be the sun, the moon. That light can help you identify the strange effects of a mirage. But the night the Titanic struck the iceberg, there was no moon, so that meant it was very dark and hard to spot any weird lighting effects. And the ocean was dead calm. So even though there were signs of a mirage, the crew on the Titanic couldn't really spot it because there was no other source of light to help them identify the weird atmospheric traits that occur when you have a mirage effect like what happened the night the Titanic sank. At 11:39 p.m. and 30 seconds, the RMS Titanic's crew finally spots the iceberg, but by then it is way too late. But William Murdoch, the officer on duty, has to try to do something, so he orders the engines to stop, and he orders the Titanic to turn hard to starboard, which, due to tiller commands, means turn the Titanic to port. And believe it or not, the Titanic is very maneuverable, and it does look like, at least for a time, that the Titanic may turn and miss the iceberg, but just barely. But as we all know, most of an iceberg's mass isn't above the surface, it's below the waterline. So even though it appeared on the Titanic that they were going to miss the iceberg, but just barely, they were still in fact heading for an impact. However, it would be parts of the iceberg that are underneath the water that would end up striking the Titanic. Not that much above the waterline would end up damaging the ship. At exactly 11:40 p.m., RMS Titanic struck the iceberg on the starboard side below the waterline, damaging 5 of her 16 watertight compartments severely and slightly compromising a 6th compartment, a small tear of just 3 feet in a coal bunker of boiler room number 5, which was the 6th compartment on board Titanic. Right after the RMS Titanic struck the iceberg, First Officer William Murdoch ordered all of the Titanic's watertight doors to be closed, and all the doors did close successfully. And at least for a time, it seems like they did avoid catastrophe on board the Titanic. Even though they did hit the berg and they felt the vibrations, I mean, it was an impact, it does seem like they avoided the worst case scenario. The Titanic did just, in fact, graze the iceberg. They hit it, but it just kind of went along the hull and the Titanic kept on going. So they believed at the time that with all the Titanic's safety features, the watertight bulkheads, the watertight doors, that it was a close call, but it seems like that they did avoid catastrophe, at least for the moment.
However, with 6 watertight compartments compromised on board the Titanic, there was no way the Titanic could stay afloat indefinitely. You see, the biggest problem with the watertight bulkheads, highlighted in red in this diagram, is that they don't go all the way up to the boat deck. They only go up to about E deck. So that meant that as the Titanic slowly started to sink, the water would be able to spill over the tops of the bulkheads and travel back and back into the next compartment. So the lower the Titanic's bow gets, the further the water can progress inside the ship.
Now you're probably wondering, what do you mean the tops of the watertight bulkheads weren't sealed? How could that possibly prevent the Titanic from sinking with any damage? Well, the way it worked was with the 16 watertight compartments, the Titanic could handle any 2 compartments compromised. So compartment here could be compromised and the ship would float. Or the first 4 watertight compartments at the front of the ship could be compromised and the Titanic could still float. You see, the way that they designed these watertight bulkheads was that if 4 watertight compartments were breached, the water would fill up to the tops of the bulkheads, the bow of the Titanic would sink down so low, but the bow would not go down low enough for the water to be able to spill over the tops of the bulkheads. So they're going up to E deck, 4 compartments breached, this is fine. Having 4 watertight compartments compromised is a pretty serious impact. So they didn't think that could happen. However, with 6 watertight compartments compromised, the RMS Titanic's bow would sink down so low that the water would be able to flow over the tops of the bulkheads. So that's essentially what happened to the Titanic. They thought that 4 watertight compartments would be the worst case scenario. They never dreamed when they were building this ship that 6 compartments could be compromised, like what really happened to the Titanic the night she sank.
At 11:45 p.m., the RMS Titanic finally drifted to a halt. They chose to just let the Titanic drift to a stop instead of reversing the engines. So at this point, Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews would have already made their way to the bridge and then begun to figure out how to carry out the damage inspection. So at this point, the officers would be learning where they were going to be sent, and they would begin trying to figure out exactly how much damage had been inflicted on the Titanic by the iceberg impact.
At 11:50 p.m., roughly 10 minutes after the Titanic had struck the iceberg, one of the higher-up officers made the decision that it would be okay for the Titanic to continue on and re-engage the ship's engines for a time while the damage inspections were carried out. Remember, they had no way of knowing the full extent of the damage yet. They had no way of knowing how catastrophic the damage on Titanic was. They still thought that this was just a side scrape, not that big a deal. Maybe a couple of compartments are flooded. So while they still had this mindset, they didn't see anything wrong with having the ship continue on at a lower speed while damage inspections were carried out.
However, one big reason for the crew's confusion about the actual condition of Titanic in the early stages of the sinking was due to the fact that the first 4 compartments of the Titanic that were compromised by the iceberg, they essentially had no personnel in them. They were essentially just cargo holds and stuff. So there was no one in there to know how bad the damage was immediately after the impact. The only room at the front of the ship that was badly damaged that had crew was boiler room number 6. You can see it perfectly in this diagram. In this diagram, the green lines you see represent the iceberg damage, where the red lines represent watertight bulkheads. So as you can tell, the crew only immediately knew about the flooding in Boiler Room 6. They had no way to know how bad the damage was in the first 4 compartments until sometime later.
Now, what I'm about to tell you is partially speculation. I have no way to verify any of this. I'm just telling you my theories based on evidence that I've seen and some speculation as to some of these events. So here's what's really happening. There is no exact time frame as to when the crew in Boiler Room 6 were forced to abandon that area. But due to some testimony of survivors, it appears that they remained in Boiler Room 6 for about 15 to 20 minutes after the iceberg impact, despite it being damaged so severely. And I'm curious as to if they were actually trying to pump out the water in Boiler Room number 6. You see, Boiler Room 6 was the only compartment at the very front of the Titanic that actually had a pump. None of the forward sections in the cargo holds did, and the rest of Titanic's pumps were located towards the back sections of the ship. They'd have to run hoses from there up to the front in order to deal with water. So, if they were in that room about 20 minutes after the iceberg impact, then that means they would have been in there when they re-engaged the Titanic's engines. Now, I've never seen any evidence that they actually turned on the pump in Boiler Room 6, but if they did remain in there for a while, then it's quite possible that they might have. So, as I said, this is just speculation, but when they re-engaged the Titanic's engines and the ship continued on, that put more pressure on the damaged sections of Titanic's hull, thus increasing the amount of flooding that was going on inside that compartment. So, the Titanic's engines actually reactivated for about 10 minutes after the iceberg impact. So that kind of goes along with the whole 20-minute time frame that the crew in Boiler Room number 6 said when they were forced to abandon that room. So if they were trying to hold back the water in Boiler Room number 6, then the forward momentum of Titanic only increased the water flow in that compartment, thus overwhelming the crew and forcing them to abandon it. If they hadn't re-engaged the engines, maybe the crew could have lasted in Boiler Room 6 a little bit longer, but this is highly debatable, and this is just a theory based on evidence that I've seen and some information that I know about the Titanic.
At 11:56 p.m., the crew on board the Titanic, having realized the seriousness of the situation and how badly damaged the Titanic is, the Titanic's engines are ordered to stop for one final time. This would be the last time the Titanic's engines would function, and the Titanic would then at this point slowly drift to a halt. The crew that was now inside of Boiler Room 6 has now retreated back into Boiler Room number 5 to attempt to delay the water from proceeding any further inside the Titanic.
Right around midnight, after the Titanic finally drifted to a halt, the full scale of the evacuation was now put into effect. They started waking up the passengers, started getting lifeboats ready. This would have been the time the Titanic would have been about to send out its first distress call. So there's a lot of things going on. So think of it like this, from 12 a.m. to 12:15 a.m., this is when the real work on board the RMS Titanic began. And this is when the full scale of the evacuation and what exactly was going to happen to this ship was finally starting to sink in on the Titanic's crew.
Now, while the crew on board the Titanic was working to get the lifeboats ready, get the passengers woken up, etc., another problem came upon the crew on the Titanic. You see, right around this time, they started to vent out the steam on the Titanic through the funnels. You see, at the time that the Titanic struck the iceberg, it had essentially been operating under a full load of steam. And when the ship stopped, they had to get rid of all of this excess steam before a pressure burst the tank and potentially could cause some boilers to explode. So at this point, all the excess steam inside the Titanic started to vent out through the ship's massive funnels, and it was so loud that the officers on the bridge on the deck trying to get the lifeboats ready could not communicate with each other unless they were screaming at the top of their lungs, and the person they were talking to was standing right beside them.
Honestly, just try to think about how difficult that must have been for the crew of Titanic to try to get the evacuation underway, keep everything organized, keep everything running smoothly, while the steam is roaring out of these massive funnels. I mean, just imagine being around a sound that is so loud that you can barely hear yourself think. On top of that, you're trying to stay organized. I mean, honestly, as far as I'm concerned, the Titanic's crew should get a lot of praise for operating as well as they did under those circumstances. Okay, so now we're going to jump ahead to between 12:15 a.m. and 12:30 a.m. At this point, the Titanic had been broadcasting a distress signal for a little bit of time now. The first lifeboat is about ready to be lowered. There's passengers coming up on deck. The evacuation is well underway at this point.
Around 12:15 a.m., the RMS Carpathia, which at this point is roughly 50 to 60 miles away from Titanic, is sailing along, and its wireless operator, whose name was Harold Cottam, had already signed off for the evening. So at this point, even though the Titanic was broadcasting a distress signal, the crew on board the Carpathia did not know about it yet. But then a miracle did happen on board the Carpathia. You see, Harold Cottam was about to go to bed for the night, but just like Jack Phillips and Harold Brad on Titanic, he was a little bit of a tech nerd, and he liked using the tech, he liked listening to messages, he liked to know what was going on. So he decided to turn on the radio just for a minute to see what was up, and he heard the Titanic's distress call and responded immediately. He sent a message to Titanic, what's going on, what's the situation, and Jack Phillips on the Titanic responded, come at once, we're sinking. So at this point, Harold Cottam responded and wrote a message immediately back to the Titanic telling them that they're on their way and rushed to give the message that the Titanic is sinking to the captain of the Carpathia.
Just think about how lucky it was that Harold Cottam was just so happened to turn the radio back on and hear the Titanic's distress call. If he hadn't have done that, the Carpathia would have been just like the Californian, a close ship that could help the Titanic, but with the radio off, they wouldn't know what was going on. But now, if you would think that was the end of the Carpathia's story, you're wrong. You see, when Harold got up on the bridge and told the bridge crew that the Titanic was sinking, they laughed at him. They're like, the Titanic's not sinking. Someone's pulling a joke on you. Essentially what the crew on the bridge of the Carpathia was referring to is, as wireless technology was getting more common in the early 1900s, people were actually sending out fake distress calls pretending to be other ships. So you know how we have trolls on the internet now that always like send out fake messages or try to mess with people? Well, essentially people were doing that 100 years ago at the time of Titanic with wireless technology. I mean, seriously, it is just the craziest thing ever that people 100 years ago were doing the exact same thing that people today do.
Now, the captain on board the Carpathia had already retired for the evening, and upon seeing that the crew on the Carpathia weren't going to help him, Harold decided to go and bust into the captain's room while he's asleep and tell him that the Titanic is sinking. Now, at first, the captain of the Carpathia was furious. He's like, "What are you doing? Why'd you break into my cabin? Don't you know I'm the captain? You're supposed to treat me with respect." But once Harold told him that the Titanic was sinking, the captain of the Carpathia wasted no time to respond. He immediately calmed down, immediately got dressed, and told them to turn the ship around and start heading for the Titanic as soon as possible.
Now, unfortunately, the RMS Carpathia only had a speed of around 17 knots, and with it being 50 to 60 miles away from the Titanic, that means that the Carpathia will need around 4 hours to reach the Titanic's position, meaning it will not arrive in time to actually help the ship before she goes down. But besides that, the captain of the Carpathia is running full steam ahead and trying to get to the Titanic as quickly as possible. So now we're going to jump ahead, we're going to jump back to Titanic, and now we're going to talk about the time frame between 12:30 and 12:45 a.m. on the Titanic. And this is a very eventful time as far as key events that occur on the Titanic during the sinking.
Around 12:30 a.m., a mystery ship is spotted on the horizon, roughly 10 miles or so from the RMS Titanic. Now, this ship isn't responding to the distress call of the Titanic, so the crew on board think that this ship is essentially an older steamer that doesn't have wireless. Maybe the wireless is off, they don't know. So at this point, they decide to start launching distress rockets, although it would be another 10-15 minutes before the first one goes up. And they also decide to try to signal the ship with a Morse lamp. A Morse lamp is essentially a giant flashlight that they use to signal other ships with Morse code on ships that don't have a Marconi wireless system on board.
Now I'm going to jump ahead to 12:40 a.m. on the Titanic. 12:40 a.m. is a very eventful time on the Titanic. Two big things did happen during this period. Number one, this is also the time the very first lifeboat left the Titanic. Now I'm going to go into more detail about that in a second, but first I want to talk about something else. The second thing that occurred at this time was in boiler room number 5, deep inside the Titanic, essentially the front line where the crew inside of this ship is trying to hold back the water. So, just for your knowledge, in boiler room number 5, the Iceberg did in fact breach this compartment. This is the 6th compartment on the Titanic, right around pretty much after the first funnel. So essentially, the Iceberg put a small 3-foot hole inside of the coal bunker of boiler room number 5. Now, just to clarify, the coal bunker is past the watertight bulkhead. The watertight bulkhead itself wasn't damaged. So that meant the water was flooding inside of a coal bunker. So the crew in boiler room number 5 did secure this coal bunker. They shut it up, they secured it, they made it as watertight as possible. However, the room that holds this coal is only held together by a thin sheet of metal. It's not designed to be watertight. So even though the crew did keep boiler room 5 from flooding for a time, around 12:40 a.m. is when this thin sheet of metal, this basic little room designed to hold coal, could not hold back the pressure of the water that was flooding into it anymore, and the whole wall of the coal bunker collapsed, rapidly flooding boiler room number 5.
There's a clip from a Titanic documentary called What Sank the Titanic that showcases perfectly what it would have been like for the men inside of Boiler Room 5 when they were forced to evacuate this room. So I'm going to show you this clip, leave it completely intact, audio and everything, just so you get an idea of what it would have been like for the men in Boiler Room 5 when the coal bunker wall gave way.
The pressure makes the very metal begin to scream.
That is an absolutely unbelievable shot, and it perfectly showcases what it would have been like in Boiler Room 5 right as soon as that coal bunker wall gave way. And believe it or not, we do have a survivor from there. His name was Frederick Barrett, and he would actually in fact make it to a lifeboat. He was actually in Boiler Room 6 right as soon as Titanic hit the iceberg and saw the hull of Titanic open up. And then he moved back into Boiler Room 5 and was in there when the coal bunker wall collapsed, and yet he still made it to a lifeboat. He's got one of the most crazy survival stories from the Titanic, and I am going to make a dedicated video about him at some point. All right, so now let's jump back up to the boat deck and get to the lifeboats. So the two officers that were put in charge of the lifeboats was First Officer William Murdoch and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Now, First Officer William Murdoch was put in charge of the lifeboats on the starboard side of the Titanic, or the right side, and Second Officer Charles Lightoller was put in charge of the lifeboats on the port side. Now, both of these officers were given the order, women and children first, but each of them would interpret these orders differently. First Officer William Murdoch took it as what it says, women and children first. Second Officer Charles Lightoller took it as women and children only. Now, these actions by these officers would have serious consequences during the sinking. First Officer William Murdoch's evacuation went a lot more smoothly than Second Officer Lightoller because he was more flexible about the whole women and children first thing. And Second Officer Charles Lightoller was just like, if you're not a woman or a child, you're not getting on the boat, period. So this caused a lot of situations on his side of the ship because families did not want to be separated in the course of the evacuation.
Now, even with this confusion among the officers on exactly what the captain's orders on the women and children first with the lifeboats meant, they still did succeed in getting all the lifeboats off the Titanic in a fairly efficient manner without any lifeboats being lost. And that's a big thing to say considering you're on a sinking ship and you need to evacuate 2,200 people. There were some pretty major incidents with the lifeboats throughout the course of the evacuation where these lifeboats were almost lost, including its occupants, but this didn't happen. All the lifeboats on the Titanic were successfully launched, with the first one leaving the ship at 12:40 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the Titanic had struck the iceberg.
Anyway, guys, I'm going to have to end the video right here. I thought that I could squeeze the entire story of the Titanic into a 20-minute video, but we're 20 minutes in and it's only 12:40 a.m., so yeah, I mean, I can't do the entire Titanic story in a 20-minute video and have it be accurate and, have the ability for you guys to completely understand what was going on that night. So yeah, so we're going to make this video, we're going to make the sinking of the Titanic into a several-part series, maybe even 3 parts. So expect the next few videos of that series to come out in the next couple of days. Anyway, guys, hey, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you all for, enjoying the ride. Thank you again for helping this channel get to 30,000 subs. I really couldn't do it without you guys. And yeah, all right, everybody. Well, hey, you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good night, everybody.